All right, welcome to part 3. Part 3 of our glowing antler tutorial. Following the Spoon Graphics video, I'm going through step by step and explaining each of the decisions that are being made. So at this point we're done with our antler blur, but we are going to add one more layer on top of the antler layer, antler copy 4. And this layer we're going to use a paintbrush to add more glow. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're not dragging the antler copy here. We're just going to create a new layer from the bottom of the layer palette. So that's what this does if you're not dragging a layer down there. If you mouse over it, it says here, create new layer. So let's go ahead and create a new layer, layer 1. Now you can name this. I would recommend naming all of your layers. You want to be as descriptive as possible. And we're going to go ahead and name this Painted Glow. Now we're going to go ahead and grab the brush tool. Now the brush tool is a little bit behind my screen casting menu over here, but you can hit the B key on the keyboard. Every tool has a shortcut key, and you can see brush tool when you mouse over it in parentheses it says B. If you just hit the B key on the keyboard, it will select the brush tool. So let's go ahead and grab the brush tool, and I'm going to use the shortcut keys left bracket and right bracket to change the size of my brush, and I'm going to use a combination of the shortcut keys shift plus left bracket and shift plus right bracket to change the hardness of the brush. And what that describes is the outside of that brush, how hard the edge is. So let me just show you. If I go and hold the shift key down and I click the right bracket key several times, you'll see that when I paint with my brush on this Painted Glow layer, it will be a circle with a relatively hard edge. Now if I go over here and hold the shift key and hit the left bracket a bunch of times, I'm going to paint with a brush with a very soft edge. So each of these brushes are effective for different things. For this particular effect, we want the softest edge possible. I'm going to show you where to find these in the menu at the top as well. Now I'm also going to use my history palette to step backwards. So I don't want either of these brush tools to stay there, so I'm going to walk it back by clicking 2 history states back. Now, to be clear, I'm not clicking over here. This is a history brush. Pardon that. If I click over here, this is a history brush. I don't want to do that. I actually want to click on the layer itself over here. My history brush should be living up here. So I just want to click on the last thing that I did before I did the brush tool, which in this case is name change. And then I can close my history palette and get back to business. So what I want to do is grab over here the size of the brush, in this case about 800 pixels, maybe a little bit less, 600, something like that. 500, okay. And again, I can use the right and left bracket keys to change the size of the brush. And this is where I would adjust the hardness from 0 to 100%. So the shift plus right bracket key will get my hardness, somewhere along the spectrum in between 100. And then if I wanted to make it softer towards the 0% hardness, I would use the shift plus left bracket key. And so I do think somewhere around a 600 is going to be what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the right bracket key until I get to it. And I'm going to make sure that I have over here white selected as my foreground color. You can see black is set as the background, white is set as the foreground. But if I hit the D key on the keyboard, that will, and this is something I do almost every time I use a brush. Whenever I'm using a brush, I will often hit the D key before I do anything else, because that defaults, D for default, it defaults your foreground and background color to black and white. So if you've been painting with another color recently, you want to get to black and white. A really easy way to do that is to just hit the D key on the keyboard. The X key on the keyboard will switch your foreground and background colors. So in this case, you've got black as the foreground, white as the background. If I hit the X key, it switches them. So white is in the foreground and black is in the background. And if you're paying attention, that's where we started, or at least we thought. But let me just show you where this is something that I do kind of by habit every single time I'm using a brush is, if you've got a color that looks close to white but isn't quite white, down here, sometimes that can kind of fool you and you're like, oh, that's just black and white if you look really quickly. So D and then X to paint with white, X again to paint with black. I want to make sure that my opacity and flow and smoothing are set to 100% in this case. Oftentimes when I'm using a paintbrush, especially if I'm modifying a layer mask, I'll be using opacity, flow, and smoothing in different percentages, sometimes all the way down to like 2% or something like that. And so it's important to just double check that the opacity, flow, and smoothing are set to 100% and your mode is set to normal when you're using the brush in this case. So all of that is to say, get a brush, soft edge, big enough, and paint with white on this painted glow layer, somewhere right in the middle of each antler, something like that. It looks okay. I actually think I'm going to want a bigger brush, so I'm going to go ahead and step backward. Now the shortcut key to step backward is Command Z, undo or step backward. If you have a newer version of Photoshop, we're using Photoshop 2018, these can actually get a little confusing. So that's often why I'll go to my history palette and just back up like this. I think I want a bigger brush. In this case, let's go ahead up to 800 and add that nice glow. All right, something like this I think is going to look good. We're going to modify this and you'll see how in just a moment.